Well, we are continuing this journey. Last week, we looked at a lot of the questions that people ask Jesus, both opposition, friends, and even a question that Jesus asked the disciples. This week, we're going to continue in this journey of just looking at the various ways that people ask questions of Jesus and look at his response. And this is particularly in Matthew 18, a I think still a very relevant question that people ask,
Hmm.
and it's on this issue of forgiveness,
Hmm. Oh.
right? Like I want to think like just for a moment. Let's think about like a time when we
Had
were
to
offended
forgive.
and
Let's
we
not do that. No, I'm just kidding.
had to forgive someone. Is that
Yeah.
how did that make you feel? Like how easy or difficult
Yeah.
was it to experience offense and the need to forgive?
Mm.
I think it's in some ways I think it's easier to ask for forgiveness from somebody
Yeah.
than it is to give forgiveness to somebody that asks.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you
Yeah.
mean?
Well, for me, I mean, I, if somebody's harmed me or harmed
Mhm.
someone that I
Mhm.
care about and stuff like that, I'm a lot better at revenge than I am forgiveness.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But if I've hurt somebody, I immediately want that to be made right, and it's easier to ask for that because I want that thing to be made right. If somebody's hurt somebody I care about, I'm not so sure I want it to be made right.
Hmm.
I'd rather they had the hammer brought down on them.
That's honest. I appreciate that. And I'm doing some introspection here too, Bill, as you're describing this. And I think that I am probably more comfortable asking for
Mm.
forgiveness as well. I get all in my head about what have I done wrong and how can I fix things. So when I've been wounded, I still get in my head about what
Yeah.
have I done wrong and how could I fix things. And I will miss the fact that I'm bitter or miss the fact that I'm defensive or I'll miss it because I'm looking at other parts of me. And that's a problem because then I get hard shelled or mean and I don't even
Mhm.
notice and I
Mhm.
can't own it.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I agree for the most part with you, Elisa, and you, Bill. But at the same time, there are those times too when either maybe we don't think that we did anything wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? And yet forgiveness is being asked of us, and we really don't want to ask for forgiveness in those moments. So I'm also thinking of those situations where either we hurt somebody accidentally and they're making a much bigger deal about it than we feel like it was, or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Those moments can be really hard to ask for forgiveness. I think overall you're probably right that it's harder to give forgiveness because when we feel like our freedom has been hindered or jeopardized in some way, if we get fired from a job, oh gosh, I remember how long it took me
Mm-hmm.
to be okay in that situation. When someone physically hurts us, it's really hard to, like you said, offer forgiveness. But it also can be pretty hard to ask for it sometimes
Mhm.
too, I think.
Forgiveness is challenging.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, and there's so many different angles in which, like you said, either receiving, forgiveness can be difficult, or just being
Yeah.
in a place where, or being in a place where you admit wrongdoing. I mean,
Yeah.
we've all heard those lame political apologies.
Yeah.
If anyone was offended by
Yeah.
something that I
Right.
may have
Yeah.
said,
If-
Yeah. It was
you know what I mean?
in May, and yeah.
And that is becoming increasingly
Mhm.
more
Mhm.
prominent, where is it something we don't know how to do well,
Mhm.
or maybe not even want to do, think we
Yeah.
should do.
Yeah.
And so I think in the midst of that, this passage is very relevant for where we are today, and we see Peter ask Jesus this question in verse 21 of Matthew 18, and we'll go until we basically just see Jesus' response in verse 22. I mean, yeah, so just two verses,
Okay.
and who would like to
I'll
read
get
that?
it. I'll
Okay.
get it. Okay, so this is Matthew 18:21 and 22. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times.
Okay.
My translation says 70 times 7.
Mhm.
Right.
You know what I'm already stuck on is the fact that at the end of our last conversation, about questions. We were talking about humility, right? And that's in the same context and chapter of this conversation where they're asking about forgiveness. And as I'm even thinking through the examples of what I was saying earlier, one of the hardest reasons that one of the things that makes forgiveness so hard, both to offer and to receive, is often we think more highly of ourselves than we should.
That's right.
Yeah, when we're wounded, the first thing that gets wounded is our pride.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So let's get into the mind of Peter. And I think the context, Daniel, that you set was really good because it does, frame, again, this fourth discourse in Matthew's gospel where, Jesus is really wanting to drill down into the nature of the kingdom and what it looks like to be his representatives, because he's about to leave them and they're going to be left in charge. And in the midst of that, and Jesus is just starting in verse 15, had this whole conversation about restoring someone who sinned against you. And, and he talks about these different steps to take. If the person doesn't listen to you, send somebody else. If they doesn't listen to them, bring them before the church. And so Peter's like hearing all these different levels, and he goes, wait a minute. Okay. Okay, so how many times do I need to forgive, my brother or sister who sins against me? And then he kind of throws out a suggestion, as many as 7 times. Now, what do you think is going on in Peter's mind as he asks that question and, how he frames it with even the suggestion?
I feel like he's responding to exactly what you said. He's got all these steps that Jesus just offered of forgiveness, and it's almost like, oh gosh, there's a lot more to this than I thought. Like, what does this even really look like? Do I really have to forgive him? Like, I don't know, like even 7 times?
Well, I think, wasn't there also a rabbinic tradition that required you to go 3 times, forgive 3 times? And so he's actually kind of being very generous.
Double
saying,
plus
I'll double
one.
it and add 1 for good measure,
I love it.
I mean, there's a sense in which he's trying.
He's such a sincere heart in this moment. And this is just an aside, Rasool, but I'm noticing in verse 15 and then in verse 21, he's talking about brothers and sisters. This is our body of Christ. These are disciples, which is just radical. We just zoom past that and realize Jesus has included women in ministry here.
Absolutely.
It blows me away every time I stop and notice that.
No, so noteworthy. Yeah. So glad that you brought that up. And the other thing I think that is an interesting thing when we start at verse 15, you realize that the steps that Jesus just gave, if your brother sins against you, and go and rebuke him in private. If he listens to you, okay. If he doesn't listen, bring 2 or 3. If he doesn't, bring him before the church. That's per sin. Like, so let's say you got to go to 3 steps. For each one,
this
that's
could
3
be every
times.
Sunday morning.
That's
all
9
Sunday.
times at that point of going through this process. And so, Peter's like, wait a minute now. And let me just kind of up the ante, maybe kind of show I'm being really spiritual. 7 times. And then what do we make of Jesus' response?
77 times or 7 times. 7 times,
Yeah, 77 times or 70 times 7 times. It's still way off the charts of what Peter was throwing on the table there. The thing that I think is so interesting, Rasool, and I don't know if this is what you want or not, but the presupposition in both cases is that somebody's sinned against me.
Yeah.
Not that I've sinned against somebody else. If somebody sinned against me, maybe I'm leaning toward the 7. If I've sinned against somebody else, maybe that 70 times 7 sounds pretty good.
That's good. And actually, we're going to get into that because when you see after Jesus gives that number, he then turns to a parable.
Yeah.
That points to that very issue. So I'm going to go back to that, but we're going to just put a little bookmark. But let's talk about this 77 or 7 times 7. Because in Peter's count, is he thinking up to 7 times? I'm going to be measuring. I'm going to be counting literally, like how many times. And then after 7, if we get the number 8, and you've done it again, you've cut me off again, you've stolen from me again, you lied to me again, then I'm officially off the hook from not forgiving you.
Yeah, but I think that's an important point to make, though, because what about for those people that in their lives someone continues to hurt them over and over and over again, are we saying that they're just supposed to stay in that setting? Right? Are they supposed to just continue to put themselves in a position where they get hurt over and over and over again?
Such an important question, and especially leading in a church, being a pastor at a church, that these are issues that really come to life in the congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I have to often kind of counsel and shepherd people through is that we oftentimes overlap the issue of trust and the issue of forgiveness, right? Like, I can forgive someone who steals money from the church, right, or steals money from me. That doesn't mean I'm going to trust them with the bank account and the password, you know what I mean,
Yes.
immediately or at any point
Yeah.
after that. And so I think that there is wisdom and value
Mm-hmm.
to making sure that my heart posture towards someone
Mhm.
and how I look at them and how I respond to them, how do I pray for them, do I, where do I release them from that debt, is a different set of questions than do I put myself in harm's way continually and allow them to continue to harm me. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
And I know I'm taking it out of context, but as you were thinking, as you were speaking, Rasool, I immediately thought of the words of Jesus, to be wise as a serpent but gentle as a dove.
Oh yeah, I think
Because the wisdom says, don't put yourself back into that position, but the gentleness says, but I still need to love this person and forgive this person and hope for reconciliation.
right. And that is a thing that we can strive for, to get to a place of restoration of relationships. And I think even restorative justice is something that even in our criminal justice system, that people are realizing that the old model of just punishing people and lock them up, throw away the key, actually not only doesn't allow for redemption for the one that's locked up, but it also doesn't allow for a sense of resolution for the person who was offended. And so now what people are doing, and this is of course only when the victim chooses to engage in this process, but they'll actually have opportunities for the offended to interact with the offender. And what they're starting to see is it actually creates this thing where now I'm not just fighting the system if I'm in prison, but I'm actually looking at the person who lost a loved one because I was a drunk driver or whatever. It has this way of softening us, of changing us. But I think this is important because with the parable that Jesus draws at the end, and then he compares it to a king who's settling debts with a servant. And there's this one servant that owes 10,000 talents, the equivalent of millions of dollars today. And he was going to be held accountable for that. And he was going to be thrown in prison. He begs, for mercy, and he's given mercy. And then it flips. And then he gets out of prison. He gets out of probation and he's free. And somebody else owes him a fraction of the amount, a few $100.
Yeah.
And he grabs him by the lapels and say, "Pay me what you owe me."
Yeah.
And everyone, and it's interesting because in that parable, it is the servants that look around and go, "This is wrong.
Yeah.
This is just not, we
second.
can't have this." And what's the point that Jesus is driving home? Who is the servant that owes the 10,000 talents, and who is the one that owes the few hundred?
Yeah.
We are.
We are. Every one of us. And he ends this in verse 35. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart.
And that's, kind of where we can see the importance of forgiveness, and where we land in proximity to that is that Jesus is teaching us here that forgiveness should be our posture, and it should be our natural response, because that's the response that Jesus gave us and continues to give us as we live. So we've been exploring different questions and really looking at the power of questions. But not all questions are created equal. Elisa, you mentioned, earlier in an earlier discussion that we had, that sometimes questions can be used as weapons. And it's important for us to understand the difference, to distinguish, when is a question coming from a sincere place, and when is it coming from a disingenuous place, because I think it requires a different response, especially when we're trying to either share a theological insight or a truth. We live in an era of gotcha questions.
Yeah, that's true.
Those gotcha questions, question like, so when was the last time you cheated on your wife?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't answer it yes or no, or else you're wrong either way.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess the question that I would have for you, Rasool, is, don't you think it's really hard to tell what somebody's motive is sometimes in the question they ask? I mean, sometimes it's pretty obvious, but other times, how can I know if they mean it genuinely or not?
Yeah. You can't read their minds and their intentions always. And so you have to respond from a place of genuineness ourselves.
Right.
Yep.
But that can
And
be dangerous too.
perhaps the way to discover that is by asking them some clarifying questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Oh,
this
yeah.
is why we're going to talk today about questioning questions.
Okay.
And really looking at, and this is something we see Jesus do all the time, but particularly in this passage in Matthew 21, which I don't know about you, but there's some humor in the Bible oftentimes
for
that
sure.
I just really enjoy and appreciate. And this is kind of one of those moments in Matthew 21. And we're going to look at verse 23, starting there and going to 27. So
I'll start.
great.
Matthew 21, verse 23, and when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?
Jesus replied, I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin?
And they began reasoning among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, you will say to us, then why did you not believe him? But if we say from men, we fear the multitude, for they all hold John to be a prophet.
So they answered Jesus, we don't know. And he said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.
Yeah, I can see the humor in this because I'm thinking of a comedian that I heard one time talking about politicians who get away with using, well, I'll answer that by asking you this, and how that comedian wished he was able to use that same question in school when a teacher asked him a question about,
Right.
well, hey, what's the square root of this? And he goes, well, let me answer that by asking you this. How much wood would a woodchuck chuck? I rest my case. Right? And so I can see the humor in this story because it feels a very similar type of idea.
I bet it didn't feel funny to those Pharisees, though.
Probably
Well,
not, yeah.
And I, there's a part of me that goes, gee, Jesus, that's kind of rude. Why don't you tell them? Don't you want them to know? And, is he being exclusive? So I want to know what else is going on here.
Yes, well, let's set the context. I mean, first of all, this is Matthew 21, so there's only 7 chapters left. This is, toward the end of Jesus' earthly ministry.
After the triumphal entry, so we're in the last week.
Right, so we're there. He's now entered the temple, we're told in verse 23. So he is there. Yep, go ahead.
For the second time in 2 days, and the first time he came in, he got angry and cleared the temple.
Yes, that just happened.
So then he's coming back in the temple. I can imagine just the first response is he going to do it again?
Right, and actually this question that the chief priests and elders came to him, he's teaching there at the temple, is directly related to this act of cleansing the temple. Throwing over the tables, creating a whip and driving out the people who were essentially exploiting people in the temple.
So who gave you the authority to be the policeman of the temple?
Exactly.
Okay.
So by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the right, Jesus, to raise such a ruckus and to cause such a fuss and to do these things that you're doing? Interesting question. On the surface, even legitimate, maybe even genuine. How does Jesus respond to these sets of questions?
He talks about the baptism of John and asks another question of them.
Yeah.
Human origin or divine origin?
Yeah, he starts probing. And maybe this goes back to what you were saying earlier when somebody asks us a question and we really aren't sure where that question's coming from, that we probe a little bit just to get clarification. I don't think Jesus necessarily needed clarification, but I think he wanted to expose what their real motive was.
Right, and it gives them an opportunity.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to have a conversation about authority? Let's have a conversation
good.
about
That's
John's
good.
authority, because my authority is directly related to the one who was the forerunner, which the scripture said was going to come and prepare the way for the Lord, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about it. So it's related. It's not just a random red herring. He's not just asking how much wood would a woodchuck, but he's actually, you know what I mean? He's connecting this issue of authority.
Yeah.
So he says, if you really care, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Did John's baptism come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Now, Matthew gives us this commentary that describes how are they thinking about this question and how they're going to respond.
Well, they're thinking it seems to me they were thinking we were trying to trip him up, but he's kind of put us in a place where we're liable to get tripped up.
Yeah.
Right. And what's the dilemma that Jesus has now put at their feet about this question of authority?
They feel like it's a lose-lose for them because they can't see how they can answer it in such a way that it doesn't make them look bad.
Right. And you see that part of this is none of this has to do with what's true. And it all has to do with how we look in posturing. Right?
It has to do with face.
Yes.
Saving face and not losing face in front of the community.
Right. And that all even goes back to John's baptism. Why did they reject John's baptism? What did John have to say about the elders and the chief priests?
Boy, he talked pretty tough to him. Didn't he call him a brood of vipers?
Who warned you, brood of vipers, of the wrath to come?
Yeah, he was not a fan.
But it wasn't just the way he talked about them. It was also the way he talked about Jesus. Here's the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. So if John had authority from heaven and said that about Jesus, then even by them acknowledging that John had authority from heaven, then it also is a statement about who Jesus is.
Right. Now, if they were sincere about this issue of authority, how could they have responded differently to this question?
What they could have said was, we aren't sure. You tell us where his authority came from.
Was the issue, though, that they didn't know? Or was the issue,
they didn't want to believe
they didn't, right.
Accept
the issue is they denied. They said the only reason why they said it was of human origin was because they were afraid of the people.
Yeah.
Because they hold him to be a prophet. They didn't hold to John to be a prophet. They were holding to their own, because all of that would have critiqued them. For them to experience that would mean that they would have to admit that they were wrong. Yeah. And the things, the exploitation, the sinfulness, the unrighteousness, the hypocrisy that both John and Jesus exposed about them, that they would have to own up to that and go, yeah, you're right. That's us. And now I realize and I recognize your authority. And I didn't before.
And it's even more than that too, right? Because they were in seats of authority.
Right. Or they could have stuck to their guns and go, okay, we don't believe your authority and we don't think John had authority. And they would have had to deal if they were being honest. But because they weren't being honest and that wasn't their intention, they say, we don't know.
I realize I'm a little confused as I'm thinking through this. The term authority, we've thrown that around a lot. What do we mean by that? What do we see that word authority and how's it being used in this context?
Great question. I mean, the whole passage hinges on this concept of authority. And we know when we talked about Jesus cleansing the temple, right? And he says, it is written, my house will be called the house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves. And so he even identifies the temple with, he's attributing with the sense of my house. So essentially he's saying, I have the authority to tear this temple down, talking about his body, raise it up again, that I get to respond to these realities in this way of seeing the sinfulness around me because I am an authority over you.
And is this authority like religious authority? This is what's right, this is what's wrong? Is this a governing authority of these are the laws that you need to live into and follow?
Well, it depends on who Jesus is, his identity. It comes down to that. Because if he's the Messiah, if he's the King of the Jews, then that means by definition that they are subject to him, not the other way around. If he is the word that they are parsing and interpreting, then that means that they have to come to him for a true understanding of how to understand it and not themselves. But it requires that kind of submission. But what they decide is to cling to their own political and even religious authority apart from Jesus. And that is the point of conflict.
And if I'm reading this right, and we may not have time to go into this, Jesus next tells some parables where he really positions the posture of what is expected by the Pharisees, the kingdom and the Messiah would be about, versus what he's bringing, which turns everything upside down. And he's basically saying, John came to turn things upside down. I came to turn
Right.
things upside down. And until you relinquish your posture
Right.
and instead yield to become humble, as we talked about
Mhm.
yesterday, then you can't get this.
And I think that comes right down to why we need to question questions, because when a question is not coming from a posture of wanting to learn, when it's not coming
Yeah.
from a posture of really trying to discover, then we're ended up trapping ourselves and not really disclosing for them. So I think part of the reason, I know you said, wow, that felt a little harsh. Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. But I think that statement was a revelation in and of itself to say, okay, because we're not really talking about authority, you're really just trying to trap me again, or you're really just trying to challenge me, then I'm not going to dignify your false, disingenuous question with a response. And I think oftentimes we need to think about that, because so often, and I love sharing my faith, and I love doing it in New York City and things. And I think there's two things that can happen with why it's important to question questions. One, because sometimes the question that people want to ask isn't the question that they've actually formulated to
That's
ask.
good.
And so we end up answering the wrong question. So when someone could say,
That's
well,
good.
how could, do God allow, bad things to happen? What
Yeah.
they're really saying is, I miss my grandma and I don't understand and I'm hurting
Yeah.
about why, this allowed that. But if I just try to answer this from a theological,
Yep.
philosophical standpoint,
Right.
I missed it. I missed the opportunity. So that's part of it.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think the wisdom of Jesus here is for them to have a few layers peeled back, because at this point I'm not sure they even know their own hearts.
Yeah.
Jesus knows their hearts better than they do, and he's really trying to drill down with them so that they can come to grips with their own struggle, which started with rejecting John the Baptist.
Yeah, and I think we see that as he tells the stories, Elisa, that you're talking about, because in some ways he goes on to answer these questions, even though he says, well, I'm not going to tell you then.
But he does.
But here, let me tell you a few stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he wants them to get to that heart.
So he invites them
And
to
he-
listen and
Yeah,
to own their posture.
And that especially the one that happens right after the parable of the two sons, the one that said he was going to do the right thing and then didn't, and the one that said he wasn't going to do the right thing and then he did. He says, okay, which one did his father's will? And it's talking about the tax collectors and prostitutes. He says, look, they started off from a standpoint where they weren't doing God's will, but then they had a change of heart. And then they decided to do it, and they will get into the kingdom before someone who is just trying to posture. And so, I mean, I think and that leads to just the last piece about questioning questions, that Jesus also tells us not to cast pearls before swine, and that there are some times when people are engaging in gotcha questions and just want to kind of fluster us, that it's like, you know what, that's a sign that it's actually better to move on than to continue to invest in a conversation that is only meant to confuse, to discourage, or to provoke. And that's why it's so important to question questions. One of the most scary questions that I get sometimes from my wife, if I'm not completely paying attention, says, are you listening to me? And that can be a tough one, because I all of a sudden have realized and kind of come to grips with the fact that maybe my attention was diverted and I wasn't fully engaged as I thought I was.
Can I assume that it doesn't help to say, define listening?
And it doesn't always help to parrot back exactly the words I just said, because then now he's listening. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I get that. I actually get that question more from my daughter. She's a talker. And there's times where she'll ask me if I'm listening. And then I usually end up getting a qualifying question after I tell her or my wife, yeah, I was listening, but did you hear me?
What did I say?
What did I say? And sometimes I can even repeat the words.
Exactly.
But
you really don't know
my
what
wife's
she
still
said.
like, yeah, but did you hear
Right.
what I said?
Yeah. And one of the dynamics that we can't help but acknowledge and notice as you look through the Gospels, and especially through this series of questioning Jesus, is that there's this unique controversy, tension that often arises between Jesus and his relationship and interaction with women, and him often being questioned about that by his opposition and opponents.
So women specifically.
Yes.
Interesting.
But one in Luke chapter 7 really stands out to me as a unique scenario in which Jesus is questioned because of his interaction with this woman. And I think it's really instructive in our day and age to really explore that and to see what kind of points of connection and relevance does this have for us. So we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 7, starting at verse 36. We're going to go to 48. So we can each read 3 verses.
When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who had lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them.
Now when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, that she's a sinner. And Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he replied, say it, teacher.
And Jesus said, a certain moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them will love him more?
Simon answered, I suppose the one he forgave more. You have judged correctly, he told him. Turning to the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she, with her tears, has washed my feet and wiped them with her hair.
And you gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet.
You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet.
Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little.
Then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Okay, so we'll stop there. And there's a lot in this passage, but what are some things you immediately notice about this situation that we have just read?
Super uncomfortable.
Yeah. especially with our culture
Awkward.
looking back on it. It just seems so weird in so many different levels.
It's really hard when we try to take 21st century sensitivities and overlay them to first century stories.
Right.
It's very challenging, and I think we need to let the text live in the era where it happened, and then figure out, okay, now what do we make of that for our day?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is important to, and I think if you spent time in other parts of the world, like I've been doing within Pursuit of Jesus in this journey, and you start to see, levels of physical contact, kissing on, sides of cheeks, like it's just a totally different experience when you go other places and what is considered acceptable and common versus what we consider it here. And so it is important to remember, not only is this, we're reading about another culture, but also from another time. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, what else do you notice about the actual setting here?
So they're in a Pharisee's house.
Right.
And they're reclined at the table eating, most likely. And so he's been invited into a teacher's place of, he's been invited and honored by being invited into this Pharisee's home.
Right. At least on the surface, it appears to be an honor.
Yeah. Also, I think it's really interesting that obviously Jesus reads this guy's mind. I mean, the guy, it's so interesting the way the narrator tells it. The Pharisee said to himself, and then Jesus answered him.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really interesting language.
And looking at the woman, he turns and says to Simon. I mean, there's just some very interesting, pointed communication here. The woman is a sinful woman, or that's the way the subtitle is, but she's a woman who lived a sinful life. And so she's like the opposite of the Pharisee who's doing
Yeah.
everything right. And she comes in so extravagantly, with this perfume that's worth 500 denarii. Well, maybe, but when Jesus tells the parable, he calls out this example of someone who has 500 denarii of debt versus somebody who had 50. Well, probably this perfume was about 500. So she's this extravagant sinner, if you will.
And since a denarius was 1 day's wage, that means it's the equivalent of whatever you make. It's a year and a half, you know what I mean,
It's a
of that
ton.
year total salary. So that's a lot.
And then I think the big surprise is that within this, there is a rebuke, but it's not for the woman.
Yeah.
It's for the Pharisee who invited Jesus into his home.
Right.
And
So
didn't
just
show
imagine there's this,
hospitality.
this Pharisee. So he's a well-respected leader in the town. He's this religious leader, political leader. He brings in this other very popular guest. So this is a big deal. This is just this formal dining situation. And then this unexpected guest arrives.
Yeah.
An unexpected guest with a reputation.
Yep.
A negative reputation, a sinful reputation, comes into the house of this religious leader. And what do you know about the perspective that Pharisees had about women in particular?
They would pray, I thank you, God, that I was not born a Gentile, a Samaritan, or a woman. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't exactly high favoritism for women.
Yeah.
And that was a prayer they prayed every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. And that wasn't just about sinful women. That was any woman,
Right.
anywhere. And Jesus was very different. Luke 8, just right after this, emphasizes that women were included among his disciples, followed him, ministered to him, and even paid for him, provided financial support for him. So Jesus is quite the opposite in contrast.
Yeah, and Luke in particular has a lot of the themes of what women did in relation to Jesus and to Jesus' ministry, including at the tomb after he dies. They're the first ones to show up.
The last ones at the cross, the first ones at the tomb.
Yeah.
Here was another rabbinic exposition of the law. It said, a man should ever avoid women. Thus he should never make any gestures at them, either with his hands or his feet, nor wink at them, nor jest with them. A man must not greet a woman under any circumstances, and he is forbidden to send his regards to her, even through her husband. So there was this clear wall of division. Sat on different sides of the synagogue. It was, you did not interact, and oftentimes it came from this place of seeing that women were this source of sin and temptation.
Right.
And and so as long as we avoid these women, then we'll be more safe.
Believing that Eve fell
Exactly.
first,
Yeah.
therefore
Right.
sin
Well,
came through a woman.
And still today, you go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and there's the man's side and the woman's side.
Right.
They're still separated there.
Yeah.
Right. So then, in light of all of this, and that's just even general perspectives on women, and then on this particular woman who has this reputation, we see this Pharisee say to himself, "Oh, he can't be a prophet, because a prophet, a man of God, would never allow this woman to honor him in this way, to really worship him,
To touch him.
in this way."
If this Pharisee had any question as to whether Jesus was legit or not, at this point he makes his decision. Oh, it's obviously not.
Because he's breaking all the laws.
Yeah.
Even
All
though
the rules.
Jesus is going to read his mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just so funny because it says Jesus replied in verse 40 as if he had said it out loud.
Yeah.
I know.
So right there,
Don't you
he,
love that?
he actually reveals who he is. But then he goes on to tell this story of these two debtors, one that owed a lot, one that owed a little. And Simon's, then he asks him a question: which one will love him more? It's an interesting question.
Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of come to Jesus moments with this passage because we think that we love God most through our obedience, don't we?
Yeah.
And Jesus
true.
is setting up a different standard. We love God most, this makes me cry, through our brokenness. We love him the most when we realize how much we need him. It blows me away.
I don't know that I've ever noticed the word love there before. It completely changes the whole feel of the setting and the story itself.
But you've been talking with us, Rasool, through these series of conversations about questions and questioning questions and all this different thing. You completely threw me off there, because I thought that the question you wanted us to think about was when Jesus said, Simon, do you see this woman? I mean, that's not a bad question
That's a
either,
good
because
question too.
he probably didn't.
Yeah.
Not in the way Jesus did, certainly.
He didn't see her in
That's
her
right.
humanity. He didn't
That's
see
right.
her as a human being.
That's right.
He saw her as a sinner.
Sinful
Yeah.
woman.
Yeah.
And it's something
Yeah.
that's alien and different from who I am, because
That's right.
I am a Pharisee. And no, that's such a great question that Jesus had. I'm glad you brought that out. And then he goes into this explanation, and this is where we start to discover, well, maybe the type of honor that we thought Jesus was getting wasn't, because there's all these things that Jesus is list off that he was neglected of doing. And again, hospitality in the Middle East
Huge.
is huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
And so this isn't just forgetfulness that he forgot to give him water for his feet, which would have been a common place when you're walking through a desert place. It would not have been just because he, had a bad memory that he didn't anoint his head with olive oil or give him that honor. This was almost like a setup to say, okay, you can come, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to honor you there.
Yeah.
And so you have the one person who is in this state of authority and power, who is not treating Jesus with any kind of respect and honor. Then you have this one who is seen as the outcast, who actually honors him profusely and abundantly, gratuitously, generously.
Yeah, I think that's what really is striking me here, because even if she had just come in and washed Jesus' feet and gave him the kiss and anointed his head with oil, that would have been a big deal. It would have been controversial. We'd be having the same conversation
Right,
in some
right.
ways. But she didn't stop there. She went way above and beyond to give Jesus the utmost and absolute honor that he deserved.
Yeah, and then he wraps the whole thing up with her many sins have been forgiven, because the one who is forgiven little loves little. And that's such an interesting way of saying, well, the reality is that all of us have much to be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
But the one who doesn't realize that
Yeah.
is the one who's going to withhold that and be judgmental toward other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so he turns this situation from one in which this woman is looked upon as a sinner to one in which he sees her as forgiven. And I think it does say a lot about how he engaged, and how we have to be thoughtful about following Jesus' example of what does it look like to look at those who are marginalized or who are rejected and actually honor them, exactly how he did with women time and time again. Well, as we continue to make our way through this Questioning Jesus series, today we're going to look at a type of issue that Jesus faced significantly in his ministry, and that was divisions and barriers, social barriers that that were already in place in his society that kind of created, like kind of silos of who could interact with who. But fortunately, we don't have those type of things today
Yeah,
anymore.
no.
We're
all
so
over
much
that.
more sophisticated.
Yeah.
There's neither
Yeah.
Jew nor Greek nor woman nor man. No, we're good.
There's no denominations.
There's no denominations.
Yeah.
Uh-uh.
Wow.
What are the type of barriers that you see that are that exist in our world today, in our nation, that are challenges to overcome?
You say nation, I think of politics immediately.
Sure.
I mean,
Sure.
a very, very divided political system and experience.
Yeah.
And that becomes very, very important in a country where we've gotten to the point where everything is political.
Yeah.
There's nothing that is not political.
Well, and I think maybe another word that's unique to our time is polarized. It's everything. You're rich or poor. You're, this party or this party. We are so polarizing. But back to your question, racial is still a huge issue for America.
Yeah.
And it breaks so many of our hearts, and we have so much work still to do, especially within the body of Christ.
And when you use the word barriers, Rasool, and again, understand, I'm not saying that this is inherently evil or anything like that. But my first thought was gated community, where we've put up literal barriers,
Privacy fences.
privacy fences. And I'm a fan of privacy fences. I like privacy, but at the same time, it's keeping somebody out while you're keeping something in, and both sides of that need to be weighed.
Yeah. And then, It's funny, we use two different words, divisions and barriers. On the division side, we have denominations as well from a Christian standpoint. We tend to hold very tightly to what we think the version of Christ is that we hold. But when I think of barriers, I more think of things that cause the divisions. So what are the ideas that we hold so tightly to, the barriers that then cause us to divide?
Okay.
It's almost two different pieces.
That's
there.
helpful.
Yeah.
Socioeconomic one, there's gender one.
Yeah.
We could kind of go on and on. The immigration issue.
Yeah.
On and on.
And a lot of times it comes just from the unknown of not crossing a barrier. Like maybe it's just a road that we know of in town where that's the good side of town and this is the bad side of town, or that's the bad side of town and I'm on the good side of town. Just the fact we haven't crossed the road and we have that
That's right.
unknown.
Because that's where we become human together.
Yeah.
Is to cross over.
Yeah, and you've ever even heard that phrase, the wrong side of the tracks.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was not just a matter of, figure of speech. There was literally many towns that were divided across the railroad tracks. This is where the poor, this is where the minority, this is where one side is, and the wealthy, the majority culture, whoever else is on the other side. And so we've listed a few, political, denominational, racial, socioeconomic, political, all of those things. And all of this is in this chapter that we're going to read. Every single one of those dynamics of tension we see in John chapter 4. Because one of the important questions that we must ask is, in a world that is as fractured as ours is there a word that Jesus speaks to that? Does the gospel have anything to say? The good news is it does. He does. And we're going to look at that in the passage, John chapter 4. We're going to read verse 1 all the way to verse 16.
I'll start it off. When therefore the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee.
Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon.
A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans."
Jesus answered, "If you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would ask him, and he would give you living water." "Sir," said the woman, "you don't even have a bucket, and the well is deep. So where do you get this living water? You aren't greater than our father Jacob, are you? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and livestock."
Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water shall thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life."
And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so I won't have to get thirsty and have to keep coming back here to draw water." And he told her, "Let me keep going?"
No, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go there. So, okay, there's a lot going on in this passage,
Yeah.
right? What are some initial observations you make about this?
Well, Jesus is very intentional about going to Samaria.
Yeah, I caught the same idea because it said he had to go, but we know other Jews would just walk around.
Not
They
just
would-
other Jews, like the majority of the population
Everybody.
never had to go
Right.
to Samaria. So what do you think that John puts that there for, that he had to go? What does that mean?
Well, you think about the fact that John's writing this 60 years later, and the level of detail that he gives, including the detail of Jesus had to go. It's almost like on reflection, John looks back and says, yeah, He had to go to Samaria because that was the only way he was going to meet this woman.
It was like on mission. You know, if
Yeah.
you had a strategic plan to accomplish the mission of the gospel of Christ, this would be one of the biggest steps. Go to Samaria and have this conversation with this Samaritan woman at a well in the middle of the day and say these things to her.
And one of the things that we see in John specifically a lot is Jesus saying things like, I have to do what my Father tells me to do.
I only do what my Father tells me to
So
do.
in some ways, he had to go because he has this relationship with his Father, with Father God, that said, hey, I need you to go here. And he says, yes, sir. And he goes.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we immediately see is he begins to challenge the barrier by going to the other side of the tracks,
Yeah.
the place that good Jewish men did not go to. He makes a beeline directly there. But then he also goes, and I love about this in verse 6, where it says, Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, worn out from his journey.
Oh, I love that. He's so human.
Yes.
He's so human. He's hot. He's thirsty. It's the middle of the day. He wants to drink some water.
Right.
Yeah.
And so while there, this is when the encounter happens, and then when the inquiry starts. And so what do you notice about this next phase in the story, this next point?
Well, I'm listening to this against the backdrop of yesterday's conversation about women and how they were viewed by Jewish people, Jewish men in particular, and given the fact that a man would never talk to a woman, he wouldn't look at a woman, he wouldn't joke around with a woman, nothing. And Jesus inaugurates the conversation. And so it's not a surprise that she says, what are you talking to me for? This isn't normal. What's happening here is not normal. And I think that hit me even harder because of what we talked about yesterday.
Yeah, that's so good. And the other thing is he makes a request of her, which totally changes the power dynamic. So
Isn't it that's blowing me as we're, for the first time, it's hitting me as we're having this conversation. You just said, here he is hot in the middle of the day and he sits down by the well and you think, this is the God of all the universe who made water, who formed the earth out of the deep, and he's thirsty.
Yeah.
And he goes to that extent, our God goes to that extent to meet every one of us.
yeah.
So we have access to him.
Rasool, you just said the power dynamic. What do you mean by that?
Right. So, we see it play itself out in verse 9, right? She asks, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So the power dynamic is that we know the rules. We, talked about this yesterday, that, you are a person of, of influence, of power. You're not supposed to be here. You're not supposed to be talking to me. But what ends up happening is, as opposed to the Pharisee that we talked about yesterday, who didn't even acknowledge her existence, by making a request from her, he's saying, you actually have something I could benefit from. And that shifts the dynamic to actually say that you have worth, you have value, because I'm asking you for something.
Got it.
And it totally knocks her off guard.
Yes, that feeds right into what you were just saying, Elisa, that our God even comes to the point of asking for something.
Comes as a baby, he walks as a man.
Yeah.
He's hungry, he's thirsty.
Right.
And yesterday we saw this kind of dynamic in the relationship of male-female, but today we're seeing it in more the ethnicity, because the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. They were viewed as ethnically inferior.
Yes.
Half-breed was a term they threw around.
Yes. And that was not just a clinical definition. That was clearly a negative description.
Yeah.
And so she's blown away. And then Jesus has this interesting, since we're talking about questioning barriers or questioning division, he says, if you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would ask him and he would give you living water.
Turn back around.
Yeah. You're not asking the right question.
Yeah.
Not only is she not asking the right question, but if I'm her, I'm also thinking, okay, wait a second. You asked me for a drink. Now you're saying I need to ask you for a drink? I'm confused. Who's thirsty here?
And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Jesus is thirsty physically, but she's thirsty in ways she doesn't understand.
Yes. And that actually is exactly where it goes next. She makes that exact connection, Daniel. She says, wait a minute. You don't have a bucket. The well is deep. Are you greater than our father Jacob? You know what I mean? He gave us this way, and it's like, now you're asking.
Pretty
Now
much.
yes.
Yep, pretty much.
But isn't it interesting that she's claiming Jacob?
Yeah, isn't it? I
I
hear
mean,
that half-breed echo that you were mentioning.
Because even though Samaritans had intermarried with the Assyrians and stuff and all the history behind that, still she looks at Jacob
Yeah.
As
just
a
like a
father.
Jewish person would,
Right.
Yeah.
as part of their heritage.
Yeah. And so, in this, it's so fascinating to see how he begins to just pull back the layers. And then, as she begins to, share her reservations, when he says, okay, go call your husband. And she says, I don't have one. He says, I know you have 5. And the one you're with now isn't. Okay, I perceive you're a prophet. But you guys worship here and we worship there. We we're separated.
Barriers.
We're segregated. We don't interact with each other. And then he, brings out this incredible point. Believe me, woman, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know. The true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. And isn't it amazing that the vision, the culmination of what will happen as a result of this Samaritan woman being able to experience who Jesus is that it breaks down the barriers. And so now all of a sudden, the location, which side of the tracks you're on, doesn't matter. She goes and brings all these Samaritans. She says, come tell a person who told me everything about myself, which is a fascinating experience. She goes to the well in the middle of the day to avoid everyone. After she encounters Jesus, now she goes and tells everybody where she is to go bring them to him. They end up spending all of this time together. And it just shows like, okay, so what are practically, how can we overcome these barriers today? I think what Jesus shows us is we go to the places that we're not supposed to go. We have the conversations we're not supposed to have. And we take the time to have them. This is one of the longest passages in John's gospel in talking about a particular circumstance. And one of the things I noticed, and this, as I've taught and preached this is a long passage. It's often, you can't go through the whole thing. And I think it reveals that in order to break down barriers, it takes time. It takes long conversations. It's not going to happen, and it takes people looking at you funny like the disciples did when they come back. And like, what are you doing? But when we do those things, then we are able to really begin to break down the barriers that exist, and in so doing, reflect the true nature of the gospel.
So, Rasool, you and I talked a little bit on the phone before you came to kind of talk through, okay, what's the topic going to be, stuff like that. And now I feel like I should ask more questions because the theme has been on questions. But I had no idea how much you would come and help shape us. And so we're so thankful that you joined us for these past 2 weeks just to help us think through the questions that Jesus interacted with and was asked and asked himself.
Got me looking forward to next time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do
Thank
some
you.
again. I hope we'll make that a question for him. Would you come back sometime, Rasool?
Would love to.
Thanks.
Would love to.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And as we kind of wrap up, and it has been a pleasure to be with you during this time and really just unlock what the scriptures have to say. And it's just kind of interesting to wrap up on this one because it deals with this aspect of hope and despair. Have there been a time in your life that you could think that there was a sense of despair, a sense of like, wow, I thought this was going to happen and it didn't, and all hope looked to be lost?
Yeah. There's been a few times in my life where I would describe it as despair. One of the hardest was my wife going through some really serious medical stuff that still comes back a little bit here and there, but is a lot better now than it was. But there were moments where I would be carrying her around the house or whatever, and we were in that moment of despair, wondering if things were ever going to get better.
Yeah, I think about times when I discovered how fragile hope is. When things are going great, they're going great, and they're going great. And then one reversal, and it's kind of like everything's terrible. And it's not, but that's how you feel because it's turned.
I think it's some author has said that hope is like this golden thread that connects us to heaven. And for me, I remember when we lost our little grandson as he was born too early at 22 weeks, after he'd been in utero 22 weeks, and he was too young to survive. And he was alive, and then he was not. And it was this, I think what you're saying, Russell, that moment of hope and despair. I despaired for my daughter and my son-in-law. I despaired for myself and the loss of him. But I knew the second I saw him, and I got to be the steward of that moment with him, that he was made for eternity, that he was with Jesus, and he was whole and he was perfect and his life was perfect. It was the most bizarre thing to hold those two things together. Very painful and very sacred.
Yeah, and I feel like I feel like with hope and despair both, it's often a roller coaster.
Yeah.
You know, because when you're going through a really tough situation, there's these moments of hope where you're just like, yes, yeah, we're going to get somewhere. And then there's these deep valleys of despair.
Yeah.
Pearl Buck, who was an author from many decades ago, born in West Virginia, I would add, said, "To eat bread without hope is to still slowly starve to death."
Oh, goodness.
And
Well, that's powerful.
that struck me because even in times of plenty, we can be hopeless.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at the wrong things.
Oh, that's so true. And I know one of the things that can really has caused despair in my own life is when you experience pain and disappointment. Like I remember one time in a ministry context where I'm serving and, just become disillusioned by people that you looked up to, people that you're serving. And all of a sudden you're like, God, how have you abandoned me when I'm trying to do your will?
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
And anybody who served in any kind of, and church is a unique kind of hurt because you believe that like this is something that God is in and is in the midst of that. And so when either you feel like other people have let you down or when God has let you down, it feels different. And that's exactly what we're going to look into today. In John chapter 11, two women, Martha and Mary, experienced such a thing with Jesus, and we get to see the aftermath of that.
Okay, so the background for this is Lazarus
Yes.
has died.
Yeah.
Well, this is the thing.
Yeah.
At the beginning of chapter 11, we see that Mary and Martha call Jesus.
Okay. Lazarus is sick, and
He's
Mary
sick.
and Martha call Jesus to
Right.
come.
He's sick in verse 3. And they say, Lord, the one you love is sick.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Which
so,
reminds me of all the times we say, "But Lord, I thought you loved me."
Yeah. Yeah, like we just did.
Yeah.
So picking it up in verse 17, Jesus comes. On his arrival, Jesus found out that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days, so he's died. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home.
Martha therefore said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you."
Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world."
All right. So they give word, John makes it clear the relationship that Jesus had with Martha and Mary. This is the same Mary that sat at his feet. He makes it clear that this was, they had been invested in the ministry of Jesus early on. Lazarus was, a dear friend and one who he loved. And so they say, hey, you're the Messiah. We know who you are. We have an inroads. Of course, I'm going to call the great physician
You bet.
to heal our brother.
Yep.
And what happens between verse 3 when he gets the message in verse 17 when he arrives and Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days?
Yeah, what happens is nothing. I mean, on Jesus' side, he does nothing. He doesn't come. He doesn't respond.
And
He
it-
doesn't help.
We're told he purposely
Yeah,
Yeah.
doesn't
purposely.
come so that God's glory will be accomplished.
On the other
Mhm.
side, what happens in Bethany is that Lazarus
Mhm,
dies,
mhm,
Yeah.
and they feel like it was not necessary.
mhm,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Martha picks right up on, I called you.
Yeah.
mhm,
If you had just come,
Yeah,
he wouldn't have died.
mhm.
yeah, that's right.
What do you think she's feeling in that moment?
I think if she had known Jesus purposefully delayed 2 extra days, like
Mhm.
John tells us, she
Mhm.
would be angry.
Mm.
But at this point, I think it's more just hurt and frustration.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I
I'd
think
be
she had a
angry.
sense.
Yeah.
I think she had a sense because,
Yeah.
that he was close enough. They were able to get the
Yeah.
message to him.
Mhm.
And so it didn't
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
5-6 days
If
to
you'd
get
been
there.
here, why didn't you come?
Why
Why
didn't you
weren't you
come?
here? Yeah.
Yeah.
But-
The messengers were there in plenty of time.
Yeah.
If Jesus would have left, if you'd have left right when our guys come,
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the very least, she is really disappointed.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Jesus has let her down. And
Mhm.
Yeah.
in a world where everybody lets everybody down, there's something really hard when we feel like Jesus lets us down.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think and that's what I think despair feels like.
Yeah.
You had one shot. You thought, okay, this is going to come to pass. And again, this is just a person. She recognized who Jesus is. And there's significance to the 4 days.
Mm.
Yeah.
And you know what that is? Why he waited until Lazarus was in the tomb 4 days?
Tell me.
Well, according to Jewish custom and belief, there was this idea that the spirit was still hovering over the body for several days. So a person was dead, but that they were still around.
Mhm.
Day 4, it was over. It was a
Yeah.
wrap. It had gone on, and so this is that point in the moment where there's a flat line.
There's no more hope.
There's no more hope.
Mm.
Yeah.
And yet, have you ever had a Lord, if you'd been there,
Mhm.
this wouldn't have happened
Mhm.
kind of moment?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think we can all relate to that. And even still, she says, yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. So there's still this shred of
Mhm.
Mhm.
maybe, belief. And so Jesus responds, your brother will rise again in verse 23. And then Martha does the thing that we can kind of do
Yeah. Yeah.
in verse 24. What do you
She goes theological.
Yeah.
When you don't know what else to say,
Yeah.
use biblical language because
Yeah.
it sounds good.
It
Yeah.
reminds me of all those times that we offer scriptural ideas or
Mhm.
say something to someone who's hurting, and it's
Well,
the
you know,
most
all things-
inappropriate thing we
Yeah.
could say in the
all
moment.
things work together for good. And,
Yeah.
that stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
we
it's
do that.
true.
Yep.
But in that moment,
Yeah.
It's empty. Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
Even, well, they're with Jesus now.
Yeah.
Mhm.
that's
They're in a
right.
better place.
They're in a better place.
By the way, you know what else is interesting I see here is the personalities of Martha and Mary
Mhm.
Oh.
Yeah.
still are consistent.
Mhm.
Remember, Martha is the one that, when Jesus comes to the house is busy moving around, while Mary sits at his feet.
Mhm.
Well, even here, she's the one that makes a beeline to
Mhm.
Jesus, and Mary's the one that sticks, and stays around and grieves Lazarus a little bit more. But so Martha, makes this kind of, theological, but like you said, somewhat empty statement. Okay, I believe in the resurrection the last day, but then Jesus turns up the notch and then he asks a very important question.
Hmm.
I am, this is of course one of the I am statements that we see. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, he will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?
Hmm.
I mean, puts it right there.
Mhm. Well, it's almost like Martha's Caesarea Philippi moment, which we talked about
Yeah.
the other day. I mean, it's like when Jesus looked at the disciples and says, "Who do you say that I am?"
Mhm. Mhm.
That's kind of what Jesus is doing with
Yeah.
Martha here.
Mhm.
And her reaction is exactly the same.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God. That's the
Yeah.
same thing that Peter said.
Mhm. It is.
Mm.
It's her declarative moment. Yeah. She's
Yeah.
going to declare it. She's going to choose it.
You
and
know,
she makes that statement. There's hope in that statement.
yeah.
Yes.
There's hope in that
Mm.
statement.
You know, I'm sitting here thinking about the context that we set this up in, which is despair. And I'm thinking about all the times that I've either felt despair or I know people that have felt despair. And a lot of times it's when somebody lets you down. But I think the deepest despair we experience sometimes is when we feel like God has let us down.
Mm.
And Martha, that's where she starts in this story. God's let her down.
Mhm.
Jesus let her down.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way that Jesus meets her in that level of despair, the deepest despair that we as humans probably can even experience, and then offers her hope. I think that's what I'm stuck on
Mm-hmm.
as we keep
Mhm.
talking about this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the response to that is one that gives me hope. You know what I mean? The fact that I am the resurrection and the
Mhm.
life.
Mhm.
And whether that is in a physical, tangible way, like we see happen in this, at the end of this story, where, you know, Jesus says, okay, where have you put him? He goes to the tomb, tells Lazarus to come out, and they get to see the miracle that she, you know, it was even beyond the miracle that they were hoping for. And Jesus makes it clear this was for the glory of God so that you could see.
Mhm.
Or if there is just a scenario where maybe on this side we don't get to experience that kind of the thing that we had hoped, but still in the midst of that, the greater. And I love how the scriptures talk about the hope.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just like, oh, I hope it doesn't rain
Mhm.
tomorrow, or you know, I hope I get that job. It's a hope that is firmly rooted in the reality of Jesus as the resurrection and the
right.
life.
Mhm.
And whatever that means for
Mm.
my current circumstance, what it means is in the end we win. What it means is in the end he wipes away every tear. And in the end it means there is no dying or death, and that we'll be with him face to face. And in that we can have hope.
Thanks for being with us this week.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Rachel.
Russell.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
My pleasure.